Okay, recording. Share my screen again. Okay, so currently this is what DataSource looks like. Inside your PVC object, you can specify the kind of data source that you want and the name of that data source and the API group that it belongs to. And the nice thing about this mechanism is that it's extensible in that you could define an arbitrary kind of CRD and that can become a new type of data source. Today for Alpha, we currently only support two data sources. One is Snapshot and the other is PVC, which is used for volume cloning. Both of these are currently Alpha. And the plans longer term are to kind of make this, open this up, remove the validation such that you could have any sort of third-party arbitrary data source. And you know, going one step further, we're imagining something like a data populator where you could have something that says, hey, I know how to populate a volume with something like a Git repo as a source. And then you could decouple the provisioning of a volume potentially from the thing that populates that volume with data before making it available to the workload to use. So that's kind of the longer term vision. Now for the immediate term, we are planning to move both snapshots and cloning to beta. And in doing so, we're going through and reviewing the API for both snapshots and cloning. And one of the things that's come up is this kind of data source API, and is this the way that we want it to look going forward? So an alternative to having the data source inline is potentially having the data source defined as a separate standalone object. And then inline, you would specify a name of a data source, and then that data source object would define kind of the specifics of what the data source are. And at first glance, this may seem kind of trivial, like it's just another level of indirection. What is the benefit here? But the benefit here is primarily around being able to dynamically set the data source. So you can think of a concrete example as I want the latest snapshot, whatever latest means. And so you can imagine that there would be a controller that's running that accepts a policy of like figuring out what the latest snapshot is, and it can go ahead and inject the data source. So now if the volume data source is a separate standalone object, you could feed this controller some sort of policy that says, please, you know, generate data source objects based on blah, 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 and it'll spit out these volume data source objects. And your PVC itself never needs to be modified. All it needs to do is point to a data source, like my PVC data source. And if that data source doesn't exist, provisioning will wait for that data source to exist. And if we don't do this, if we leave everything in line, the way to implement this would be maybe using an admission controller. You could imagine like an admission controller that manipulates the PVC object and then tries to modify the data source on creation time, but that becomes a lot more messy.
Can you walk through the use case you mentioned with the latest?
Sure.
Like how would that work if I have a data source that just says latest?
So roughly, I think what I imagine is you have some sort of controller that knows how to spit out these data source objects, and you would have a CRD that it accepts, and in that CRD you say, hey, if you see a PVC from me that is requesting a data source, please, you know, provision something by this name that subscribes by this policy. And the name would be my PVC data source, and the policy is created with the latest snapshot. So it basically monitors for PVC objects with a data source that is that matches, and when it matches, it'll go ahead and provision that and assign it based on the current latest volume snapshot.
But all we'll have to go on is the name, right? So it'll have to, by looking at the PVC, see this name, and know that it needs to react to that in some way.
Yeah, it doesn't actually change the implementation, Ben, as far as how last snapshot would work. What it does is it makes it really dead simple to actually create a data volume object or a data source object that could point to that through the controller.
I'm not following, like, how do I say which volume I want the latest snapshot of?
So look in that YAML right there, right? You have that data source and you have the name, Snapshot 2019-05. So if your controller knew how to handle something that was like
but the thing on the right is the thing that got created by the controller in Saad's example, right?
Yeah, I haven't thought through exactly what the controller would look like for provisioning these volume data source objects. We can talk through that design if you want. It could be something like maybe there's a policy object that we put together that says you have to pick up the latest, and then I was thinking roughly like it could be based off of just the data source name. If the data source name exists, then it goes off and creates a volume data source based off of that name. But it could get more fancy, and we could have like a provisioning object for that controller.
Yeah, I like the use case. I don't see how this proposal gets you there, because all this says is now I can put a data source with the name, and I have to do all the legwork of writing a controller that can turn that name into a volume data source using some magic. And it's like, well, if what you really wanted was that, why not just have another CRD which does what you want?
What would another CRD do though?
Well, so we said what in the original design where it's inline, we say volume snapshot and we say PVC. We could just have another one which is latest snapshot of PVC, and then you could get a chance to say which PVC you're talking about, and then some controller knows how to go figure out what the latest snapshot of that is, and it does the legwork, and it can do exactly what you want with all the richness of the ability to say what you want to say. Other than with the new proposal, all you get is a string, and you have to write a controller that knows
that's a good point. So basically, what you're saying is that instead of basically removing inline altogether, what you do is what we do with pod PVE and pod PVCs, right? We allow volumes to be defined inline as well as a PVC. And so you're saying that in this case, you could provide a data source inline as a volume snapshot or PVC, or out of band as a separate standalone object as well.
Hey, Saad.
I guess my question is to Ben's is why wouldn't we just integrate data source as a field as part of cloning that leverages the controller provisioner with it, so that vendors can implement smart technologies for their storage types to do whatever that is. So let's say I want to have my data source is another volume and I'm on a homogeneous storage type. I would be able to leverage possibly dedupe technologies to create the new copy to make that happen. I guess I'm trying to figure out why we want this to be outside of what cloning hopes to provide anyways. I just always thought this would supplement that design.
So this basically handles both the cloning case and the snapshot case. The only difference is how you specify that volume source, right? At what point do you specify that volume source? Do you specify it at the creation of the PVC time, or can it be done out of band independently? And so to Ben's point, like ideally, I mean, it's possible that you could do it in both. Like you could make data source inline and as a separate standalone object. I think my gut feeling would be, let's not do that, because looking back on inline volumes versus PVCs, ideally we should have just gone with PVCs to begin with.
No, so that's not what I was proposing. I like the only inline approach where we don't have the separate CRD, but like you're implying that we have snapshots and PVCs, but we can have a third and a fourth and a fifth thing in the future. And what I'm saying,
in order to do something like a latest snapshot, I think what you're suggesting is like have a new type, that would be latest snapshot, a CRD that would then
And the controller would just know how to do the right thing for that use case.
Yeah.
Which is the suggestion I put on GitHub, right? I'm not following exactly how this solves the latest snapshot case anyway. I thought I was, but then as I heard you talk more, now I'm not sure I really understand this.
And who writes the controller that looks at the PVC and says, oh, I need to go take that name and go create a data source object, and I somehow from that string know which PVC and what snapshot the user intended. It seems,
how does kind work? It's not restricted anymore to.
Okay, kind is a Kubernetes object class.
Yeah, I mean, that's the plan anyway, is to open up kind to just any arbitrary CRD. So that can.
Okay, so it's not limited to one snapshot and PVC anymore. It can be anything basically.
That's the longer term plan. Yes.
And I was curious, like, if I specify something bogus, or something that doesn't exist yet but will exist, like, how does it handle that? Does it just, the PVC just doesn't create?
So the proposal for that is that it would go in. So today it'll fail. It won't do it because it's invalid. But the proposal is that in the future, what would happen is the volume would remain in pending state for creating because it could never fulfill that data source.
Okay. And then at some point someone adds some code that knows how to handle that specific kind of data source, and then it works its magic, and that PVC finally gets created.
Yep.
And where is that code? Is it in some CSI sidecar somewhere?
I think it would have to be another controller. I'm not sure whether that would be a CSI sidecar or it would be another storage controller provided, or SIG storage provided controller that runs as a standalone controller.
Because we don't have any of those today, right? We don't have any.
We don't, but I think we're thinking about doing that for snapshots. So pulling out the snapshot logic into a common controller that SIG storage manages, and that way we thin out the sidecar that we have that we require the storage vendors to deploy.
Okay.
Take into account of this data sourcing into our common controller, though. This is completely new to me.
Just
I heard about it today. Is this from the data populator thing, right? John has been working on, right?
Oh yeah. So for data populators, the intention was always to open up data source to kind of any arbitrary data source. So that was always kind of the plan with data populators. But one more thing I want to mention is, so in addition to kind of dynamic data source being possible, one of the benefits of this approach is that I think it works nicely with the GetOps workflow, meaning one of the things that we want to do ultimately is you should be able to check in the state of your cluster, ideally into Git, and be able to recreate it if your cluster is nuked for some reason, and recreate it from what's checked into Git. Now, this is where it gets tricky, is with data source, because you can imagine a pod and PVC object that describe how a application should be run. They define the compute as well as the storage requirements for an application. But that application, the data that it requires could be, it's valid for the application to start with an empty volume, or with some initial snapshot as a starting point. Now, if you start off with just an empty data source, what's going to happen is that you're going to create a pod in PVC where the PVC inline says it's empty. And then if at a future point you want to redeploy that application, but snap it to a specific data source, you're going to have to go and modify what's checked into Git to change that. And every time you decide to change the data source, you have to go and update your what's checked into Git. And now if you decouple these objects into separate objects, the benefit is that what's checked into Git with your pod and PVC, you check in once to say there exists a data source, and the data source is named my PVC data source. And so then provisioning will know to always block until that data source exists. You could have that data source point to empty, for example, and say initially it's going to be empty, but at some later point you could choose to replace that with a new snapshot, a different snapshot. And in that way, basically you have this nice clean division of responsibilities of the PVC itself is only responsible for saying, describing what your storage requirements are and to say whether you require a data source or not. And then the details of what the data source are then handled independently.
I like that explanation better. It makes a lot more sense.
So let me try and get some clarification on a couple of things, because I'm kind of confused. So the first question is this kind volume data source. This is going to be an external CRD, correct? This is not going to be added to the Kubernetes.
That is kind of up in the air. I probably yes, but these kinds of things in the past, like with the CSI objects, ended up being in tree. But yes, initially thought is it probably would be a CRD.
Well, so back in Snapshot, we actually discussed doing this type of a model. We called it something different, but it was the same model. But the answer from SIG API was flat out, no new objects in the API, period.
Yes. Right. So, I mean, so that is the case. So everything that we add starts off as a new CRD, which is what we did with the snapshots, which is what we did with a lot of the CSI objects that we needed. And then it turned out that for specific use cases, so for example, the CSI ones, the CRDs just weren't sufficient, and they made an exception to allow that back in tree. I'm guessing that we're going to follow the same path with this if we pursue it, where it would start off as a CRD. We would have to evaluate if that is sufficient, it handles our use cases or not. If not, request an exception. So initially, it would definitely start off as a CRD.
So the concern I would have is if it does end up back in tree, I think that actually is a detriment. I think that limits the flexibility of the feature. But the other thing that I'm still not...
Sorry, I don't understand. How so?
So because again, if I ever want to change something or add anything custom or anything outside through a CRD of my own, I'm now hamstrung again.
You should still be able to do that. So I'm not suggesting that would change. So for your volume data source, this data source here would still be, kind can be an external CRD. So it's just adding another layer of abstraction. It's not removing any.
Okay, so because that would be my one complaint. But the other question I have is, I mean, basically, what you're describing to me though, I must be missing something, because I'm not following why you can't do that with the existing inline model today.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So if you think about how that would work with the inline model, what that means is that somehow you need to be able to dynamically inject into your inline what your data source is before you deploy it.
So you want to make this mutable is basically the trick.
Or not even mutable, just independently defined.
Okay.
So that I could, for example, define a PVC and say it has a data source, and then it's the provisioner is going to hold off on provisioning it until that data source exists, and that data source then defines kind of, it's empty, or it's a snapshot, or it's a whatever it is, the details about that data source, versus like having to do all of that together in one place at one time.
So Saad, the one area that I get a little bit concerned about with the extra level of abstraction would be around the declarative model and what we think might happen. So what happens, for example, I think we can all say that the data source gets populated at provision time, basically, and that's it. What happens, what's the expectation if somebody modifies what that data source?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would treat it exactly like we do with storage class, which is that it is a provision time parameter. Once you provision your volume, the storage class information is used, and then if your storage class mutates for any reason, it doesn't affect the volume that's already provisioned. Mm-hmm. And I imagine data source to be exactly like that, where it is a provision time. It's used for provision time, and if you mutate it after that, that's kind of on you. And we can do exactly what we did with storage class, which is not make it mutable.
Right, and I think that's the one thing with it being inline, you can make it immutable in the PVC to help enforce that logic upon people, whereas if if you have the extra layer, then people might think they could do stuff with the object.
Yeah, and I mean, that's easily resolved by just validation and making it not mutable.
But you can you can still delete it, and
You
then
can delete it and recreate it, and I mean, the same thing is true for storage class. I haven't seen it be a source of a lot of confusion.
Okay.
Except that only the admin can delete and recreate those storage classes. Here, an individual user could.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, we would have to like make the comments and things like that very clear that this is a provision time thing, and that if you manipulate it after the fact, it's not going to have any effect.
Well, and you could use the in-use labels and stuff. I mean, you could prevent that.
But I'm mostly concerned about just the loss of history if you do mutate it. Like you'll trying to figure out. It'll be pointing at a data source, and you'll be like, "What the heck happened here?"
You could potentially, like, in the PV, annotate the PV with what data source it was populated with if you wanted to retain that history.
I think we're going to have to do that anyway, because you could have, and we already do have data source on the PV object, I believe. We're going to want to retain that simply to say, once we decouple data source from the volume provisioning, whether the PV actually has been filled with the data that it's supposed to be filled with.
But that's another one of those things that we can't do in an external CSI provisioner.
But, so I was going to ask about the contents of the data sources now. So we have snapshots, we have PVCs.
Yep.
We can imagine future ones. Could vendors implement their own vendor-specific ones in principle?
Yes. Yep, that's the goal. Is that you could have a very specific type of populator that's specific to you, that is independent of the storage system that's doing provisioning, or it is part of it. Either way. And now the fun that's a whole separate discussion on how data populators are going to work. We have some designs that John and I have been working through, and other folks. Happy to discuss that, but let's leave that out because it's a separate huge design discussion.
But I think that's related, right? So how you populate that will affect this design. So do you intend to have like different? So do you intend to have like different, let's say different controllers for different kind of data source? Would that be the case, right? For data source is snapshotter, it will be handled by the snapshot controller.
So I think the way that I imagine it is like this becomes a hook that other controllers can be built on top of, right? So if you are something that knows how to populate a GitHub repo volume data source, you can look for volume data sources that correspond to that type, and then you can handle it as appropriate for you. And then we can provide a set of standard kind of controllers or sidecars that can do the complicated heavy lifting. Like the heavy lifting in a data populator scenario is, how do you decouple volume provisioning from data population such that your data populator is able to attach and mount the volume to fill it with data, but a generic workload is not able to do that. And so if we come up with logic on how to do that, you can imagine that could go into some sort of common controller that these other custom data populators could use. So as far as I imagine, we provide that heavy lifting controller, common code, and then somebody who wants to build this logic could then just implement a small shim that says, here's how to fill, I have a program that knows how to fill a volume with data. As long as I provide it and I pair it with this heavy lifting logic, I can basically provide a data populator.
And so as part of that, and I'm probably getting ahead of myself here, thinking of providing some sort of policy controller around that as well, because I think
basically what I'm thinking about in terms of policy is that it becomes a layer on top. Once we have concrete objects around data source, and then data source points to further concrete objects like volume snapshot or a CRD for your particular data populator type, you could build a policy engine on top of that basically acts on those objects as appropriate. So you can imagine for like volume snapshot, you could have a volume snapshot policy controller that knows how to, for example, age out volume snapshots over time or delete them or whatever you need to do. that would be another standalone controller that knows, oh, I operate on volume snapshot objects, and I can have some mechanism to say these are the ones that I care about, and here's my policy, that kind of thing.
It just seems like really complex approaches to solve some of the problems that we have with data sources. In particular, when it's ready for something other than, say, what we call a populator, whether that be a snapshot or a cloner or whatever it might be. It just seems to me that you implement a new status field to represent the populating status or whatever you want to call it, right? And you're done. As opposed to we've gone through and we've talked about admission controllers, taints and tolerations. We've gone through 3 or 4 different iterations of ideas, all of which have turned out to be incredibly complex. And I'm not sure I see the value in it.
In generic data populators, or?
So we have this problem for snapshots as well, is my understanding, right?
If for snapshots, like trying to do.
I'm sorry, John. What problem do we have for snapshot?
Trying to create a volume from a snapshot.
If we just do that, we don't really need taints. Is that the taints is really for the data populator?
Yeah, the data populator issue is only an issue when you decouple the mechanism that's going to be filling a volume with data from the storage system. With snapshots, so far the implementations we've seen have all been storage system implements the population, so it hasn't been an issue.
Okay.
When we talk about generic data populators, that's when this will come in.
Okay. I was trying to leave that out because I didn't want to muddy the waters as far as
yeah, and I think that's fair. Like, it's a big design discussion. I have some interesting thoughts on that as well, but yeah, we should table that.
Yeah. I do know that Jing had proposed a number of things, but maybe I misunderstood.
On the taints, right? So, but that started with the data populator, and then we thought, okay, for that we also need that for we can use that for volume snapshot or other data sources. But if we don't really need to worry about a data populator, then we don't really need those taints.
Gotcha. Fair enough.
So what I wanted to close on, and we're at the end of the hour. I should have booked an hour instead of 30 minutes, but what do folks think? I wanted to get a feel for the room. So the cons here, the drawback is that if we go down this path, we're going to be delaying clones and volume snapshots for another quarter. Both of those are planned to go to beta this quarter. Clone is pretty much ready. Snapshot may or may not make it. There's a lot of work, but Xing and Sean and Jing are working very hard on that right now. If we as a SIG decide that we do want to go down this route, it would mean that we delay both of these another quarter.
I think
Probably
actually it would be
enough,
2 quarters.
Yeah.
Right, because we would need to implement the new data source object next quarter, and then the following one can move to beta.
Yes.
Even a couple of quarters, not just 2. I think it might not even be enough.
Yeah. Thoughts? It is a very difficult trade-off. On the one hand, snapshots has been around for a long time and it is very useful. And this is putting roadblocks in the way that is slowing it down. You want to get it to beta sooner. On the other hand,
I'm really trying to imagine. So you spelled out the use case for why this is cool, and I liked it. But let's say we don't do it, and because we're interested in the timeline. How would you accomplish that use case if we don't do this? Is there any way?
I mean, so the alternative I was thinking about was an admission controller approach, where you can imagine, like, instead of the controller spitting out a volume data source object, it would manipulate the PVC object at creation time. So a PVC object gets created, you have a controller monitoring these, and then it injects a data source.
But maybe it's not that complicated. I mean, you could just, whatever's creating the PVC could just put different stuff in the PVC, right? Because PVC's always come from someone's notion of what they want their application to look like. And
sure. So this is the idea of like having a special type of data source which says like latest snapshot, that kind of thing, right?
Well, so I think one scenario where it's challenging for someone to inject the data source in their spec is stateful sets, because with a stateful set, it's the stateful set controller that creates the PVC.
Right.
So one thing I was wondering, I was going to propose, and I don't know if this is a good idea or not, but one thing to keep in mind is technically the features between snapshot and cloning are separate independent features. They're separate feature gates and separate features. So that's one thing to keep in mind. We could go one direction with one for now and one the other. I'm not saying
the challenge is that we kind of have to make a decision on the PVC object as a whole, right? So if we decide that we're going to do inline or not inline, that's a big decision. And I don't think we can cut it both ways and say we're going to do both, because if we go down the separate object route, we would need to modify the internal controllers to say, I recognize that this is a separate object and that the volume provisioning paths need to wait for it to exist, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I agree. That's definitely a concern and an issue. What I was wondering though is, given that fact, and then given the fact that what we're looking at is actually fairly close in terms of user facing API. I am wondering if this is something that could actually be worked on top of what we already have, and approach it that way as a new feature. You know what I mean? To supplant this one. I don't know if that's worth it or not.
What does that mean concretely?
So for example, you would go ahead and you would beta what we have today.
Sure.
With the intent of going to creating this external object as well, and then having that back in.
Sure.
And
so you're suggesting basically, let's move these features to beta, introduce this separate data source object, and then we can kind of deprecate the old way of doing it and then adopt this new way of.
Well, I at least want to throw it out there. I don't know if that's the best answer or not. The thing is I know how these features go.
Yeah.
And we're going to be optimistic and say 6 months. Right. 2 more quarters.
Right.
But
that's a reasonable approach, actually. So I think the beta deprecation policy is 6 months, right, Michelle?
For beta is I think 2 releases or 6, or was it 3 releases in 6 months? I don't remember.
I think it was 2 releases, but we can double check that. So what we could say is that we allow Snapshot and Clone to move forward as is, and immediately put out a deprecation notice to say the way that data source is going to be done is going to be changed in a couple of releases. Please be aware of that.
The only reason that I even throw that out there, because I'd rather wait and do it the correct way and everything else and stuff like that. But the problem is until something hits beta, in my experience thus far, we're not getting enough feedback from people in terms of implementation and usage.
Yeah, no, that's completely fair. So then I think it becomes a trade-off of, do we expect what's worse for users, to have a beta API that changes fundamentally like this, or to have a alpha API that takes, it's been stuck in alpha for a long time? I don't have that.
The deprecation policy for beta is 9 months or 3 releases.
Okay.
But because this is a PVC object, we would need a V2, I think.
Ooh.
So much for that.
But I mean, data source itself, I think, is an alpha field.
Yeah. So, but I mean, if we moved it to beta.
Oh, if we moved it to beta, then
I'm unsure. We should clarify with API if a beta field can be removed from a GA object?
I think given that, and given the 9 months, I think it's probably a no-go on that approach.
Stay in alpha till you get it right.
Yeah.
I just wanted to throw out that, Michelle, you mentioned something about templatized PVCs and how this data source field would be impacted when they're templatized, such as in a stateful set. And that seems like a question worth answering before going forward, because that'll affect either one of these approaches.
Yeah, that's
what happens when you create a stateful set with the data source?
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine that you could have a templatized data source name, and you'll have data source foo1, foo2, foo3, foo4 that automatically get created by the name gets injected into the PVC by the stateful set controller, and then you have to provide some mechanism to be able to create those objects somehow, whether you do that manually or you have a controller that generates those objects based on like monitoring the stateful set objects. Some way you need to specify what that data source is.
I think also the stateful set controller might be able to kind of handle some cases if like we can modify the stateful set controller.
Mm-hmm.
So work with the workload team right now because they didn't consider that use case. So that's why their controller is not
aware of data source at all.
Handle that case very well.
Yeah, ideally, I think, we do want the stateful set controller to be aware that data source is an important consideration and somehow have that reflected.
And I would want to have thought all the way through the implications of that before making a decision one way or the other, because I could imagine certain things being impossible or very hard.
Well, I don't think when you say make a decision one way or the other, I think you mean in terms of which approach to use.
Yeah. The question Saad is asking us, do we?
No, I think that the question on the table right now is, do we stay in alpha and start going down this path? And it sounds like the answer to that is yes.
And someone building a proposal for an application on top for Valero snapshotting on top of the snapshot API would prefer it stayed in alpha versus changing.
So I feel like we are not completely like get a conclusion what benefit of using a separate CRD, right?
I think we have resolved on that. The benefit is that you have an independent way to manage data sources, independent from the PVC object. And that results in a lot of tangential benefits.
My gut says that's probably true, but I really wish we could spell it out better than the slide just points to the latest case, and I don't find that case very compelling.
Honestly, we started thinking about this like last week when we were reviewing the Snapshot API, like thinking, okay, is this ready to go to beta? And then, initially it was the GetOps workflow that caught me off guard, which was like, if we're expecting users to be able to check in what is going to go into their cluster, how are they going to manage data source with that? And so from that, it was like, okay, if we can break apart the data source into a separate object, then you can leave your pod and PVC objects as the unmodified, immutable, checked into GitHub, and you could have something else that will automatically create these objects. And I haven't thought through exactly what those controllers would look like.
Yeah, but even they are independent, but it only matters like when you create PVC, what is the separate CRD looks like. Otherwise, even you can manage like change it later, but it doesn't matter, right? After your PVC is provisioned.
Yes.
It doesn't matter what you change.
And that's why I don't understand what this solves, because the populator proof of concept that we have is already an external CRD. and this is just an abstract data type, it just points to it. So it does the same thing that you're talking about. So I'm not.
But the point is that in order, you have to basically, when you create your PVC object, you have to know what the data source is, right? So that means that along with your definition for your workload for how you define an application, you are required, if it's inline, to dictate what the data source for that application is as well.
But that data source could itself be CRD, right?
The data source itself could be a CRD, but there's no holding off on provisioning, right? If we don't build this logic in as a first class separate object, what that means is that as soon as that volume is provisioned, it's going to immediately start provisioning. And so if you have, for example, a snapshot, and you want to be able to do dynamic snapshot provisioning, like there's no way for you to say, hang on, let me hold off on provisioning until I've made this decision.
But that you will need to build some other top level application to do that, right? You need some policy management that will not be at this level.
Yes, right.
That would be the external provisioner sidecar would have to look and say, oh, I know what this is. I'm not going to do the normal thing.
Right.
So I feel
that is exactly what this is. This is describing that in a generic way to say, hey, data source is an independent thing that external provisioner and the components that we provide from SIG storage understand and can do the right thing for.
But either way, external provisioner is going to have to open up whatever object it is and make the decision whether to call the regular create volume RPC or the create volume with snapshot RPC. Or one can imagine some future create volume from who knows what RPC.
So I mean, another way out of this is, so going back to kind of the suggestion that Ben had earlier in the call, which was we have the inline data source, and I might be misrepresenting what you said, Ben, but you have an inline data source. We're planning to make it generic, so you could have an arbitrary data source in the future. You can imagine, something like I think Ben mentioned a latest snapshot type data source, but instead of that, what we could do is introduce a new type, which is volume data source, as a separate standalone type. And then we could have Kubernetes recognize that as a first class thing. And inside a volume data source type, it would also support volumes and clones and also other types. And effectively what you would end up with is you could, for snapshots and clones, be able to define them either inline or through this new mechanism. And then for other future mechanisms like data populators, it would only be through this data source type. Now, it is the benefit would be of that approach is velocity. We don't block snapshot or clone. They can continue to move at the pace that they're moving. The drawback is fragmentation. We now provide two ways of doing the same thing, and as a user, it gets confusing. Like, oh, should I be providing this inline or external? And then it'll be up to somebody else to educate the user on which one they should do.
And I'm still very confused about the other part of this discussion that we're not having, which is how you implement these other data sources and what that actually means and looks like. Because I think that actually, well, I don't know how much impact it has on this decision of whether to have another level of interaction or not. But
yeah, I don't think it has very hard to think about implication on this, the details of that, but yeah.
Either way, you're going to have a problem, I think. Yeah. And I, for that reason alone, I'm inclined to move more slowly and say, let's not rush to beta until we can.
Yeah, that's my gut feeling, but I feel really bad considering how long Snapshot has been out in alpha and how much demand there is for it to then say, oh, sorry, we're going to hold it off for another 2 or 3 quarters or 2 quarters, 1 or 2 quarters.
Because you could have how many types of the data sources you would have, right? So any new data source, you would have an impact on this design, and then you almost feel like this will be, you can never bring this thing to
it only has to be 2 or 3 quarters if we decide to do this extra level of indirection. We could decide not to take it to beta yet and to figure out how to handle these other cases, and maybe we decide to do the thing we were going to do.
John already has done this POC for the data populator, right? So can we just look at that case and then make a decision? There's not, it's at least there's implementation there, right? So like the approach that they have been using.
Yeah, I'd love to have that meeting. That's a separate meeting.
Like, I just feel like we are just adding so many unknown use cases.
Yeah, no, I understand the frustration. It's, I don't want this to be the design that never ends, right? If you keep designing for the hypothetical, you're never going to finish.
Right, so that's how I feel like right now.
That's completely fair.
So what's driving this, I guess, Saad is?
Yeah.
I mean, what did someone say, like, this absolutely won't work the way we have it because of X, Y, and Z, and we need to reconsider that?
Yeah, that would be the in my head, the GetOps workflow, really.
Which doesn't exist.
I don't want to have to modify.
Who is the user of that use case? Is someone here use that?
Yes, I mean, that's kind of the point with Kubernetes, right? Is that you declaratively define what the state of your cluster looks like. And so your cluster should be able to go away, and you should be able to recreate it from scratch and get what you want. But so everything that you have for your cluster should be defined in some sort of YAML somewhere that you can check into Git, and that's kind of the GitOps workflow with Kubernetes.
But isn't this assuming that you're not checking the data source in?
Yes, and so what you're assuming here is that you're decoupling definition of the data source from what you have checked in. So what you have checked in is your application and what the requirements for your application are. And then you can make a runtime or deployment time decision about what your data source is going to be without having to modify any of your YAML that defines what your application should look like.
How is that different than just doing the same thing but not checking in the PVC? I mean, you're still not checking in something. There's something you got to create at the last minute. You could just check in everything but the PVCs. Yeah,
and you can do that, but the problem is that that injection basically requires you to have order of operations concerns, right? So if you have some controller that's going to populate, for example, I want the latest snapshot, you could have some input to that controller, some CRDs that say, hey, please, create this data source. And then on your PVC object, you can say, I am going to require a data source. Here's the name of the data source. Please wait for it to exist. If it's inline, what that means is that now you need to make that decision up front. So when you create the deployment at admission, you have to have like an admission controller or something that says at that point, I need to.
No. I'm saying you just don't check in the PVC, and then you check in everything else, and you create the deployment, and it can't start because the PVCs don't exist, and then.
But that doesn't work for stateful sets.
Oh shit.
Because the
stateful sets screw everything.
Well, it's not just stateful sets. It's the fact that the PVC is a part of your application, right? It's a part of your application definition. It describes my application needs this type of storage. And so
you could make the same argument about the data source, honestly. I mean, it's...
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming from. You could make the exact same argument about that, and you're just moving it to a different document.
Can I ask a kind of a leading question, Saad?
Sure.
Is what's driving this the GetOps code as configuration capability, or is this driving it from a deficiency we see in storage? Because I'm trying to understand, like, if we're looking at this from like a hybrid cloud multi-cluster storage capability long term, is that what we're trying to get to and trying to get it to fit into the GetOps model, since you mentioned that in particular, or is it something else?
I mean, it's primarily that. It's being able to say, I'm going to define my application definition once, and I can check that in, and that's, this is my application, and these are the requirements for my application. I can say it may require a data source or it doesn't require a data source. That's a decision that I can make when I create the application and the YAML for that application. And then at a later point, when I do the deployment, I can then make the decision about what that data source is going to be. Is it going to be empty, or is it going to be a snapshot, or is it going to be something else? So, if we have it inline, we can't really do that because you can't check in your PVC object. You have to mutate your PVC object.
But I mean, that's just the same argument with the data source. You could say either you check in the data source or you don't. You check in the PVC or you don't. It's where you draw the line of what you check in.
The thing with the data source, though, is that you could kubectl apply your pod in PVC, and if the data source object is separate, the provisioner knows, oh, there may be a data source here. I'm going to hold off on provisioning until that object exists. And so it aligns nicely with that kind of declarative API model of there is no order of operations. You can kubectl apply all of your YAML and the wrong thing won't happen. Kubernetes will do the right thing because it knows that you have a data source and it knows to wait for that data source to exist.
The problem is that only works with, works from the external provisioner's perspective. It only works with CRDs that it knows about and has knowledge.
But if you do it in line, you get the same property. The PVC always has the data source in line. And
no. If you do it in line, the problem is that before you deploy your PVC object, you need to make that decision. Right?
Yeah.
So if you deploy your PVC object without mutating it, it's going to provision empty. Versus if I provision it with pointing to a data source object, it will hold off on provisioning until that object is.
I mean, if the user cares, the user will know he needs to deal with this.
Can we use the volume taints concept to solve this problem?
I really think you just, if you need to create a PVC from something, you just don't create the object until you've decided what you're going to create it from. And problem is solved. As long as the PVC doesn't exist, nothing will happen. And then once you've figured out what to create it from, you define your PVC with the inline data source. And
like, I guess what you're arguing is you could have an intermediary step between what is checked into your Git and your deployer to say,
because we're already saying we're not going to check everything in by not checking in the data source. So I say, why not just also not check in the PVC?
I think even you checking PVC, we can make sure, like, if the data is not populated, it's not ready to be used. So you cannot, even, let's say the PVC is created as a, we have a way to kind of saying you cannot use that for now because the data source is not populated yet.
Sorry, say that again, Jim?
So before we had a proposal like a taint toleration. Basically, I think you taint the PVC as because the data is not ready yet. So the pod cannot start using that PVC.
But then how do you tell volume provisioning to hold off?
Hold off. So it's really depends. If you want to hold it off, then I think you can check there is a data source, but the data source, even it's inline, right? It points to a CRD, let's say, for example, snapshot. If the snapshot is not exist yet, it won't create.
Yeah, so I think there's two things. One is, why do we really care if it provisions or not, is the first thing. The second thing is if we really do, and that is really a big deal, then we could just change the flow and have it go to the controller, the data source controller, whatever that may be, to get an ACK before it does the provisioning.
So let's tackle that one at a time. So do we care if a volume provisions without waiting for data source? Yes, we do, because the storage system may be responsible for data population.
Yeah, if the source is a snapshot, you have to wait.
Yeah.
No, you're misunderstanding. So the way it works, that's the way it works today, correct? Right? So that's already in place. We already handle that. The concern here, my understanding, for example, in the GitHub workflow, which we don't actually have yet, but the example there makes total sense because you don't necessarily want to go down to the plugin and provision of volume if you don't have anything ready. That's what you're saying, right?
Yeah, I mean, like for the GetOps argument, I think the argument is more around rollback. Like, you know, you have snapshots of volumes that you've created, and you have the code for it checked in somewhere, the pod definitions, the PVC definitions, and then you decide to do a rollback, and because, you know, something bad happened to your current application, that would involve just nuking what currently exists and then creating redeploying whatever you have checked in to Git, as well as a volume source that says, this is the snapshot that I want to use. I guess the counter argument that I'm hearing is, well, if you need to create another object to represent the data source, and that object is not checked into Git, then why not just say the PVC itself is not checked into Git?
Yes.
And the challenge with that is that, well, you can't not check in your PVC because it defines what your application is, and that needs to be defined somewhere. Like, you can't say...
But couldn't you just check in the storage class and it automatically provisions the PVC? I guess...
You could check in a template of the PVC.
Yeah.
And
right, but the template still needs to define the data source.
So, Saad, since we're half an hour past the scheduled time and I saw lots of people drop off, is this worth scheduling another meeting and maybe
I think
maybe putting it into another document with pros and cons? Because it seems like
before we end, could we get like a straw poll real quick? How many people right now are feeling like this is worth pursuing versus not? So maybe do a +1, -1 in the chat window. +1 if you think this is worth pursuing, -1 if you don't think this is worth pursuing.
Stopping snapshots and cloning from going. What do you mean by that?
Sorry, say that again.
I think it's worth more discussion. Is that what you're asking, or are you worth?
Yeah, it's definitely worth more discussion, but I also just wanted to get a feel for the room to see, like, hey, is this worth following up on, or let's just drop it and move on? I guess +1, 0 means let's have another discussion. +1 means let's do it. -1 means drop it. Okay. Okay, so I think consensus seems to be let's have more discussion. There's like 3 +1s, 1, 2, 3, 4 -1s, and then a bunch of zeros. Important thing to keep in mind is that the deadline is fast approaching, the 29th, for snapshots and volume cloning for 1.16 if we want to move it to beta. So let me do this. My tomorrow looks crazy, but maybe tomorrow morning, 9 to 10 a.m. Pacific time. Would that work for folks for a follow-up discussion?
I think I have a meeting. Oh, you're talking about Pacific time, sorry.
Pacific time, yes.
Okay. Yeah.
That would be
noon Eastern.
Yeah, okay, yeah, sure. It's fine.
Okay. Okay, so I'll set up a follow-up meeting for this discussion, and we'll carry on to...
Sorry, I have a quick question. So the stuff about the populators and other data sources, is that all on GitHub? Where can we find a pointer to that?
I threw up a bunch of comments on John Griffith's PR for cloning. Feel free to carry on the discussion there. I'll link to I'll link to that bug in the chat window real quick.
All right, great. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. All right, folks, we will reconvene tomorrow morning. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Saad.
No problem. Take care. And I just pasted in the window, the chat window, the link to the bug or the PR. All right, take care, everyone.